Well, because she posed a challenge to the royal family, and she's a fascinating person. I mean, she's a person who started from nothing and has become a world global star. And that route to the top has never really been properly by Meghan, for their jokes, for their behaviour, for being Etonian stockbrokers or whatever. She didn't like their non-wokery. Right. And after the shooting weekend, they're all...
Oh my goodness, the work that they do at Children's Hospital LA is otherworldly. And I think from my standpoint as a mother...
Two important points. One is, it's quite normal for parents, grandparents, families saying, what will your new child be like?
It was not a press conference. It was not a palace correction. It came from a book when Tom Bower began briefing journalists on what he described as newly corroborated details surrounding Lilibet Diana Mountbatten Windsor. The reaction inside royal circles was immediate and deeply uneasy because this was not a rumor pulled from social media. This was an author known for documentation, sourcing, and relentless follow-up. At the center of the fallout stood Meghan Markle, facing questions not about emotion or intent, but about accuracy, and whether the public record had quietly drifted away from the truth. Today, we examine what Bower claims to have uncovered, why the palace refused to intervene, and how a child's story became the most sensitive battleground yet. The moment did not arrive with headlines. It arrived with briefings, quiet calls placed to senior editors in London, advanced copies flagged with annotations, and a familiar name resurfacing in royal media circles, Tom Bower. Those who know his method understood the implication immediately. When Bower reopens a subject, it is rarely to speculate. It is to reframe the public record. According to journalists who attended early briefings, Bower was not presenting a single revelation, but a correction. He described discrepancies in how the story surrounding Lilibet Diana Mountbatten Windsor had been publicly understood. Windsor had been publicly understood, focusing on process, timing, and attribution rather than motive. The language was precise, no accusations, no emotional framing, just a claim that elements of the narrative had drifted from verifiable detail. That distinction mattered. Royal editors reacted cautiously. For years, coverage involving royal children has been approached with restraint, bordering on avoidance. But Tom Bower's reputation complicates that instinct. He is known for sourcing within institutions, triangulating accounts, and persisting when others step back. This was not social media chatter. It was an author asserting that something in the official story required re-examination. The stakes escalated quickly because of who the scrutiny fell on. At the center stood Meghan Markle. Her public narrative around motherhood and naming had been delivered with confidence and emotion, framed as personal and private. Bower's intervention threatened to recast that narrative as incomplete, not false in intent, but inaccurate in detail. Within hours, media panels shifted tone. The question was no longer whether the story was sensitive. It was whether the record was accurate. Bower's focus, according to those briefed, centered on how information had been conveyed, who had authorized certain representations, and what institutional confirmations had and had not occurred. He reportedly cited interviews, timelines, and off-the-record clarifications that never made it into the public domain. The effect was subtle but destabilizing. He was not challenging love or intention. He was challenging attribution. Visuals amplified the tension. News packages replayed the original announcement footage, stills from early press coverage, and exterior shots of Portland Hospital, even as anchors reminded viewers that medical privacy limits public confirmation. The images suggested structure and protocol, contrasting sharply with the emotional language that had framed the original story. Inside Buckingham Palace, the reaction was immediate and divided. Royal correspondents described two camps forming quickly. One faction argued for absolute non-engagement. Any intervention involving a child's story, they warned, would be perceived as institutional overreach. The other faction feared that Tom Bower's claims, left unanswered, would harden into accepted correction. That split delayed any coordinated response. Palace aides understood the risk. When an investigative author asserts documentary clarification, silence can be read as confirmation, But responding risks legitimizing a challenge to a narrative the palace did not author in the first place. This was not a palace correction. It was an external one. The human drama sharpened as attention returned to Meghan Markle. Commentators described her as exposed not because of wrongdoing, but because narrative authority was being contested. Her strength had always been control of story and tone. Bower's tone was neither sympathetic nor hostile. It was forensic. Supporters rallied quickly, accusing the author of targeting a child to undermine a mother. Critics countered that Bower was scrutinizing adults and institutions, not children. The argument itself extended the story's lifespan. Prince Harry's role became a secondary focus. Analysts noted his absence from the early reaction. There were no attributed briefings from him, no attempts to contextualize the claims. Some suggested legal advice had drawn a hard line around engagement. Others interpreted the silence as strategic uncertainty. The antagonist structure became clear. On one side stood an author asserting correction through documentation. On the other stood a public narrative built on personal testimony and emotional framing. Between them sat institutions bound by protocol and privacy, reluctant to intervene. By the end of the first day, headlines had recalibrated. Words like new truth and clarification replaced controversy. The shift was subtle but decisive. This was no longer a debate about feelings. It was about records. Royal correspondence emphasized a critical point. Bower was not alleging conspiracy. He was asserting that the public had been told a simplified version of events that did not fully align with institutional reality. That claim, if left unaddressed, would linger regardless of proof. As night fell, no statements were issued, not from the palace, not from Meghan Markle's representatives. The silence was read in conflicting ways. To some, it signaled confidence that the claims would fade. To others, it suggested the opposite. What was undeniable was the shift in gravity. A child's story had moved from protected narrative into contested record. And once that boundary is crossed, every subsequent silence carries weight. The file had been reopened, and with it, the stakes had changed. The second day began with an absence that spoke louder than any denial. Buckingham Palace offered no correction, no contextual briefing, and no off-the-record guidance to trusted correspondents. For an institution known to quietly steer coverage when facts drift, the stillness was conspicuous. Royal editors noticed immediately. In cases involving adult royals, silence can be strategic. In matters touching children, it is usually absolute. But this moment sat uncomfortably between those traditions. Tom Bower was not asking the palace to comment on a child. He was challenging how adults had described process, consent, and confirmation. That distinction complicated every internal calculation. Behind palace walls, advisors divided sharply. One faction argued that any response would legitimize an external author's reframing of a private family story. They insisted the palace had not authored the narrative in question, and therefore bore no responsibility to defend or amend it. Another faction warned that allowing Bower's account to stand uncontested risked letting an unofficial correction harden into accepted record. The divide stalled action as the palace deliberated. Media momentum shifted decisively toward Meghan Markle. Panels that had initially framed the issue as academic now focused on exposure. The tone changed from curiosity to consequence. Analysts debated whether Meghan's previous statements about Lilibet's story were incomplete, oversimplified, or merely misunderstood. The distinction mattered less than the direction of travel. Bower's interviews amplified that shift. Speaking in measured terms, he emphasized documentation and corroboration, carefully avoiding emotive language. He did not accuse. He clarified. That posture proved disarming. Viewers accustomed to partisan arguments found little to rebut. When an investigator insists on process over motive, emotional counterarguments lose traction. Visuals did the rest. Broadcasters replayed original announcement clips, headlines from the period, and exterior shots of Portland Hospital, while reminding audiences that medical details were private. The juxtaposition suggested order and protocol against personal narrative. Even as anchors cautioned against inference, the imagery implied a mismatch between how events were described and how institutions typically operate. The pressure widened to include Prince Harry. Commentators noted his conspicuous absence from the response. In previous controversies, Harry often attempted to contextualize or humanize disputes. This time, there were no attributed briefings, no supportive framing, and no effort to bridge perspectives. Analysts suggested legal advice had narrowed options to silence. Others read the quiet as uncertainty. That uncertainty became interpretive fuel. Sussex-aligned voices attempted to re-enter the story on intent and affection, arguing that procedural nuance should not overshadow parental meaning. Critics countered that public records and institutional confirmations are not optional details, they define boundaries. The debate hardened along those lines, and the middle ground evaporated. Inside palace circles, the concern grew more acute. Advisors who favored engagement argued that the longer the institution remained silent, the more Tom Bower's account would be treated as definitive by default. Those urging restraint countered that responding would set a precedent the palace could not afford, inviting authors to litigate private narratives through publicity. The stalemate held. Public sympathy fractured accordingly. Some audiences viewed Meghan Markle as unfairly targeted by an author leveraging institutional mystique. Others saw a necessary correction to a story that had benefited from ambiguity. The word shame began appearing in commentary, not as a moral judgment, but as a descriptor of exposure. Being corrected publicly, even without accusation, carries reputational costs. Media outlets adjusted language again. Revelation gave way to record. Controversy gave way to correction. Each shift moved the story further from emotion and closer to permanence. Records outlive interviews. That truth haunted the coverage. By evening, the palace had made its choice. The silence would stand. No background briefings softened the edges. No friendly analysis redirected focus. The institution appeared willing to absorb short-term discomfort to avoid long-term entanglement. In doing so, it transferred the weight of response entirely onto the Sussexes. For Meghan Markle, the effect was stark. Narrative authority, once her strongest asset, now appeared contested. Her defenders argued that authors do not own the truth. Her critics replied that documentation often does. The clash played out nightly on panels across 2 continents. As the day closed, one reality was clear across royal desks. The story had moved beyond whether Bower was right. It had become about why no one with institutional standing was correcting him. In the absence of contradiction, clarification began to look like confirmation. The silence did not end the debate. It recalibrated it. With each hour that passed, the balance shifted further away from personal narrative and toward the cold endurance of record. By the 3rd day, the argument had shifted again. It was no longer about whether Tom Bower was right. It was about why no one with institutional standing was disputing him. In the absence of contradiction, clarification began to calcify into record. Royal correspondents described the mood in London as uneasy, not because of any single claim, but because of the direction of travel. Inside Buckingham Palace, advisors acknowledged a hard truth. Once an external investigator frames a correction in documentary terms, silence does not pause the conversation, it redirects it. The palace's long-held instinct to protect children by refusing engagement now collided with a new reality. The challenge was not about a child's life, but about adult representations of institutional process. The divide within palace offices hardened. One faction insisted the line could not be crossed. Engaging would invite authors, journalists, and commentators to litigate private narratives through public pressure. The other faction argued that the palace had already learned the cost of prolonged ambiguity. When records are contested, refusing to clarify does not preserve neutrality. It assigns it. That calculation shaped what followed. Nothing, no briefing, no anonymous correction, no gentle guidance through trusted intermediaries. The institution chose to stand still, accepting that whatever damage occurred would be preferable to setting a precedent it could never unwind. As the palace held, attention returned relentlessly to Meghan Markle. The framing of coverage tightened. Commentators spoke less about intent and more about consequence. The word shame circulated not as a moral verdict, but as a descriptor of exposure. To be corrected publicly by an investigator without institutional rebuttal carries reputational cost, regardless of motive. Images from recent appearances were replayed with a colder lens. Analysts cautioned against reading emotion into posture. Yet the visual language proved potent: a forced smile, averted eyes. Headlines framed these moments as the strain of losing narrative authority. Supporters objected, arguing that personal demeanor cannot be evidence. Critics replied that perception does not wait for evidence. The contrast with Tom Bower's tone sharpened the imbalance. He spoke calmly, returning repeatedly to documents, timelines, and corroboration. He avoided speculation. That restraint disarmed emotional rebuttal. When an author insists on process rather than motive, the debate migrates from feeling to filing. Prince Harry remained largely absent. Analysts noted the shift from his earlier pattern of engagement. In past disputes, he often attempted to contextualize or humanize events. Here, there were no attributed briefings, no supportive framing, and no effort to reassert the couple's version of events. Some suggested legal counsel had narrowed options to silence. Others believed Harry had little leverage to counter a claim framed as documentary correction. That absence had consequences. Royal commentators argued that silence from Prince Harry transferred the burden entirely onto Meghan Markle, reinforcing the impression that this was her narrative to defend alone. The perception, fair or not, deepened the sense of exposure. The marriage, once presented as unified against external pressure, now appeared asymmetrical in response. Media language continued to evolve. Panels stopped asking what happened and began asking what would endure. Records, they noted, outlast interviews. Once a correction enters the archive, future retellings default to it unless challenged with equal authority. That reality haunted the discussion. Behind the scenes, advisors warned of a longer arc. Even if the story faded from headlines, it would resurface in footnotes, biographies, and timelines. Each resurfacing would revive the same question: why was the correction never disputed? In reputational terms, unanswered corrections accumulate weight. The human cost was evident. Friends of Meghan Markle described her as wounded by the reframing, insisting that nuance had been stripped away. They argued that procedural details do not negate parental meaning. Critics countered that public narratives involving institutions must be accurate, not just sincere. The clash was irreconcilable because it operated on different definitions of truth. Royal analysts emphasized a crucial distinction. There is lived truth and recorded truth. Lived truth belongs to families. Recorded truth belongs to institutions. When the two diverge, the institution's version tends to persist, especially when reinforced by documentation. As the week wore on, coverage cooled without resolving the core issue. The palace did not move. Tom Bower did not retreat. The Sussexes did not engage. The story settled into the background as a reference point rather than a headline. That settling was itself a verdict of sorts. Future discussions about Lilibet Diana Mountbatten-Windsor would now carry an asterisk, not because of anything she did, but because adults had contested how her story was told. The cost of that contest would be paid over time in credibility rather than headlines. For the palace, the episode reinforced an old lesson with modern consequences. Silence protects boundaries, but it cedes narrative ground. For Meghan Markle, it marked a rare moment when narrative control slipped not through scandal, but through correction. For Prince Harry, it underscored a diminished role as intermediary when disputes moved from emotion to record. Nothing definitive was proven in public. No wrongdoing was alleged. Yet the impact was unmistakable. The record had shifted, and with it, the balance of authority. In the monarchy, stories come and go. Records endure. When an investigator reframes the record and institutions decline to contest it, the change does not announce itself loudly. It simply becomes the version that survives. That is why this moment mattered, not because it exposed a secret, but because it altered what will be remembered when the noise fades. And in royal life, What is remembered often matters more than what was felt in the moment. In the monarchy, stories fade. Records remain. If you want deeper investigations into royal power, authorship, and the moments that redefine legacy, subscribe, like, and share, because once the record changes, everything built on it shifts too.